it's really great to be sharing findings from an 18-month journey looking at the state of open data, and I'm really keen that we don't have too much presenting from the front, but we get into discussions. I'm doing a couple of talks and events on the book, but this is my favourite because we've got many of the authors of the chapters that make up this book here with us, and I want to give you as much time to have discussions and hear from them as possible. We know who's here at the OpenGovHub for the first time, but just to get a sense of you first, I just wanted to ask people to raise their hands. If open data is a completely new topic to you, this is your first time. Of course, 10 years in, no one. If it's something you've been working on or engaged with for the last 2 to 3 years, a couple of people, maybe people who've been involved for more than 5 years, and the lifers who this has been part of their last decade or more. So we've got a real mix in the room of people over that period. Well, part of the State of Open Data project was about taking stock, more or less, of the global movement for open data. And in our agenda for this, I said I'd try and give you an overview of 43 chapters in 430 seconds. So I'm going to set my timer now and see if we can do that. As I've said, this was a collaborative project. When we started in 2017, it came from a recognition that the open data movement had grown an awful lot since the early days of 2009, when these ideas were first breaking onto the global stage. And to explore how it's developed, how it's evolved, we brought together over 60 different authors and many more contributors to share their insights and to look at open data, not only from a quantitative perspective, but also qualitatively, going beyond the generalizations about data and to say, what does this mean in particular regions, in particular sectors, for different stakeholder groups, and for cross-cutting issues across the field. So in the book, we use 5 lenses to explore the state of open data. There's a historical lens that runs through the whole book, and particularly in the online companion to the book, we have timeline resources to explore that. And then we have 4 major sections, each with an introduction, and then 7 to 16 chapters in each, looking at different regions, sectors, cross-cutting issues, and stakeholder groups. And we put that together through a collaborative process that involved not only our authors brainstorming the key issues, it involved the authors then reaching out and us supporting outreach to the much wider community around the world to get different perspectives in. It involved a peer review process and the final editing into the book that we've got here, and also into the open access online resource. So each chapter's there, open access, PDF, open data. You can get the markdown behind it if you're committed to the more source material as well. And I also want to highlight this has been a project of the Open Data for Development Network, which is a global partnership with hubs across the world working to spur social change and development with open data. So I'm going to take you through those 5 lenses I mentioned in the book as rapid fire as I can. The first lens is the historical. And what we do in the introduction to the book is look at the past editions of the International Open Data Conference as a way of understanding the history and how it evolved. So back in 2010, we were talking portals and platforms and putting data online. By 2012, when again the conference was in DC, the conversation had turned to impact. How are we getting impact from that data being published? By 2015, when we met in Ottawa with that community, there was a real focus on different sectors, no longer data in general, but what does it mean for agriculture, for extractives? By 2016 in Madrid, the conversation was about the global goals, but the local impact. So not only sectors, but localizing open data while having shared principles. And by 2018, lots of other data debates were coming into the picture: artificial intelligence, data infrastructure, and the idea that perhaps open data was also under threat, or we were seeing dark sides to data emerging. But that broad brush history has played out in very different ways in different places around the world. And in the book, we've got 7 regional chapters, and they look at the way in which open data activities now do exist in every region around the globe, but take a different character. For example, in the Middle East and North Africa, the narrative is around data-driven innovation, whereas in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, we find much younger NGO organizations operating within an accountability and anti-corruption framework. popularising the open data agenda. And so these different framings reflect both regional difference, but also difference of timing when open data first made it into those regions and appeared in the agendas it was therefore attached to and kind of domesticated alongside. And that has a big impact on how we might strategize for supporting open data in different regions, and how, when we're bringing a global community together, we need to cross-learn. Secondly, we use this stakeholder lens to see how different stakeholders engage with open data. This map comes from the chapter by Fernando Perini and Michael Jarvis, looking at who's been funding different areas of open data work using the data gathered from the environment scans. And you can see some key players there, but we also find lots of players who are funding just particular sectoral work, maybe funding accountability in Central Europe, or people funding work on agriculture alone. And it helped us see a much wider community who are potentially engaged in open data. But funders and many others face some big questions about how to move from treating open data as a standalone idea to an area where they can invest through other sectoral programming. And Craig Hammer has a chapter looking at multilaterals work and the large investments that multilaterals put into data infrastructure, but often not open data infrastructure. So we're building out corporate registers, land registry systems, and so on, without thinking about how these can generate the open data we need for the future. And so there's some opportunities and challenges ahead there. For journalism, as Alex will be able to reflect, there are still key challenges of funding the kind of investigative, data-driven journalism that can get great value from the data that's now available. And governments are having to balance questions of institutionalizing open data and governing the way data is handled, with avoiding recreating forms of gatekeeping and data kind of control that were one of the reasons the open data movement was born in the first place, to challenge that. And so as open data enters its second decade, each stakeholder group is having to work out its role and how to work in a much more complex data landscape, and how to be aligned with these other groups dealing with different issues. That brings us to some of the cross-cutting issues in the book. A lack of investment in data literacy comes out in many of the chapters. The need to focus on data literacy is really key to turn access to data into action for social justice and social change. And there are also chapters that pick up on questions of gender equity and indigenous data sovereignty, issues that have only really come onto the open data agenda in the last few years, but challenge some of the assumptions of power structures not only baked into the open data movement, but also baked into the data sets that we've been opening up over the last decade. And that's all come together with the need to think more critically about privacy, about data infrastructures, and about how we balance open by default with the need to protect some data, and to recognize that open by default isn't open always, but it is about shifting the conversation that we have. And in the chapter on AI, we also explore how new narratives about data can try and treat open data just as a raw material for training the next generation of AI. Yet, open data offers an alternative approach to the centralizing power structures of machine learning technologies, where it can support small data solutions that empower communities with collective problem solving, rather than imagining we can number crunch and impose policy solutions from above. I've got about 20 seconds left, I think. I didn't quite get there in time. So I'm not going to skip over it entirely, but we have also the real meat of the book in the sectoral chapters that look at different contexts where open data is in action. We see across these real different levels of open data maturity. Areas like agriculture, where a lot of investment's gone into developing a sectoral open data agenda. Areas you might expect more to have happened, like telecoms, where the open data agenda has always been quite peripheral, and yet to make it to the core of that. And I encourage you to use the discussions in a moment to find out a bit more about some of these sectors, about how extractives or development assistance or national statistics communities have been embedding open data ideas, principles and practices in their work. So across all those chapters we look back, but we also look forward to the horizons of open data and look at what the future holds. And we have in there 12 overall recommendations split across 4 different stakeholder groups. As I've hit my time, I'm not going to go into any of those now, but you'll find them both in the book and in the online companion to it. So hopefully that race through 600 odd pages of research and work can give you a sense of what there is to explore. But what we wanted to do, so I'm going to bleed now actually. What we wanted to do today, much more than just present, is have conversations about how this is applicable to the work we all do. And for that, we're going to be hearing from some of our authors, and we're going to be discussing with them in a kind of World Cafe sort of style around tables in 2 rounds of conversation. So, what I'm going to do in a second is hand this mic around to anyone who's one of our authors who's prepared to share who they are, what the chapter was they wrote, and their kind of 30-second summary of all their work. And then after we've heard from those authors, we're going to break out, rearrange the chairs and tables a bit, such that you can then gather with those people. You can choose, you'll have 2 chances, so listen out for who you'd like to most kind of gather and talk with. You'll then